You, you're on the air.
Oh, GN staff or guest?
Guest.
That's just Hrdayananda. I remember. Damodara or Damodara? Um, is the internet very good here? Is the staff internet better? Is it the same password? Okay, let's try staff because the oh, you shared it? Oh.
Yeah, we should be on. Yeah, you're on, right?
Right. Why don't you sing Radha Madhava?
Share light coming in from me. All right. It's a shine.
Okay, let me just
Got your sequence on. She standing.
should we turn this around so they can see Sarvatma?
This one?
Yes, like
Check the camera again. Let's see now.
Jai Prabhupada. Jai C.C. Radha Damodar. So, can everybody hear me?
I'll turn it up.
For those who are not here, we're in a beautiful community of Gita. So, Srimad Bhagavatam, translation and purports by Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So is the verse written anywhere? No? Oh, then I get to monopolize the chanting. Okay, this is a prose verse of the Bhagavatam. Most of the verses, of course, are in metered verse, but this is a sort of free prose verse, which we find, especially in the fifth canto and other places in the Bhagavatam. So it's as follows: Evam karma vishuddhya tasyantaryakasha sharire brahmani bhagavati vasudeve purusharupopalakshane Vatsakustuva vanamalari dharagirupalakshe Nija Purusha Hridlakitenatmani Purusha Rupena Virodhamana Uchaistam Bhaktir Anudinam Edhamana Laya Jayata. What's that? Oh, 577. Very interesting verse. So we'll read the translation and purports by Srila Prabhupada. Translation: in this way, being purified by ritualistic sacrifices, the heart of Maharaja Bharata was completely uncontaminated. His devotional service unto Vasudeva, Lord Krishna, in 3 day after day. Lord Krishna, the son of Vasudeva, is the original personality of God manifested as Super Soul as the impersonal Brahman. Yogis meditate upon Paramatma, situate heart. Jnanis worship the impersonal Brahman as the supreme absolute truth, and devotees worship the supreme personality of God. The body is described in the Shastras. Its body is decorated with the Srivatsa, the Kaustuba jewel, and a flower garland. His hands hold a conch shell, disc club, and lotus flower. Devotees like Narada always think of him within their hearts. Prabhupada's purport. Lord Vasudeva, or Sri Krishna, the son of Vasudeva, is the supreme personality of Godhead. He is manifest within the hearts of yogis in his Paramatma feature, and is worshipped as impersonal Brahman by Jnanis. The Paramatma feature is described in the Shastras as having 4 hands holding disc, conch shell, lotus flower, and club, as confirmed in the Srimad Bhagavatam 2.8. Kechit sudehantariavakashi pradesha matram purusham vasantam chaturbhujam kanjaratanga shanka gadam dharana. Paramatma is situated in the hearts of all living beings. He has 4 hands which hold 4 symbolic weapons. All devotees who Paramatma within the heart worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead as the temple deity and the impersonal features of the Lord and his body is Brahman effulgence. So we're going to dive into the Sanskrit of this verse here and see what the Sanskrit is literally saying, of course, as given the meaning of it, what it ultimately is about. And he's done that also in his translation, which has a lot of material which is not literally in the Sanskrit, but what the Sanskrit ultimately means. And this is a traditional way of presenting the verses. I actually gave a talk on this very topic of Prabhupada's translation style when I was at Harvard, and they published it. Oh, the university published it, and explained is that if you look at the Bhagavatam, I think it's at the end of the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto, where Sutta, the great speaker Sutta, tells the better tells sages at Naimisharanya that I heard this knowledge, this Bhagavatam from my guru, Shuka. And now I'm going to now Shava Yishami. I'm going to literally make you hear it, which means I'm going to now recite it to you, literally make you hear it. Shava Yishami. Then he says, Sutta says, Yata Adhitam Yatamati. Adhitam means to read. Yata Adhitam is the way in Sanskrit of saying literally, according to the actual reading of the text, or literally. And Amati, according to my relation. So Prabhupada, in that sense, is following an ancient tradition of Bhagavatam teachers and students in that he gives the literal meaning, but also gives his own realization. And of course, he often combines these in what is called in English the translation. But even the word translation or translate in English can mean not only to literally reproduce a text in another language, but also it can mean to explain something. In fact, that should be in the dictionary. Let's see. So translate is to express the sense of words or text in another language. So express the sense of it. Anyway, but it's always good to look, at least I think it's always good, to go into the very literal sense of the Sanskrit, and then we can actually see how Prabhupada is developing certain ideas. But we always begin with the literal Sanskrit, and that's actually the way Prabhupada presented his Bhagavatam, because in Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, every verse begins with the actual Sanskrit in Devanagari and in the Roman text. So as Prabhupada begins with it, we'll also begin with it and see what it says. So this is a very complex verse grammatically, but ultimately has a, like every normal sentence, it has a subject and a verb, which is sort of the basic structure of the sentence. So this verse, the subject is you, and the verb is, which can literally or manifest the verb jan, to take birth, like janma, birth, janmastami. So the simple Sanskrit sentence here is that bhakti ajayata, that devotion arose. And it arose in Bharata. Or actually, it arose, Bhaktir arose, Bhaktir in the Lord. And we would say, in English, you could say devotion for Krishna, and in Sanskrit, you say devotion in Krishna. So devotion in Krishna arose, and it arose for Bharata. So Bharata's devotion for Krishna manifested or was born. And that's the simple Sanskrit sentence. But all the other words are modifying or explaining one of those words. So it's too bad we don't have it here manifested. But you can, I guess everyone has a phone now, so it's welcome to the 21st century. So, and of course, Avam, the verse begins thus. So just like in English, when a verse begins or a sentence begins with the word thus, it's referring to something that was explained earlier. Like, for example, he rode his bike all day, thus he became tired. So the word thus indicates that something happened because of something else. So this verse begins Avam thus. So the something else thus is referring to the previous verses of Bharata's spiritual practice. He was very diligently engaged in bhakti yoga in various ways. And so because of that spiritual practice, thus karma vishuddhya, which means literally by the purity of action. Vishuddhi is purification or purity, and vishuddhya, by purity, karma of action. So it's interesting to see how Prabhupada translates these two words, which literally mean by purity of action. Prabhupada says, by offering everything for the service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and not desiring any results of his pious activities. So that's how Prabhupada translates these two words in the word for word. And of course, if you read the Bhagavad Gita, it turns out that's what purity of action is. So Prabhupada again is explaining it in the word for word. But what it literally says is, evam thus, karma vishuddhya, by the purity of action. And which means that you offer everything to Krishna without selfish desire. And yeah, that's it. So by this purity of action, vishuddha sattvasya, this refers to Bharata. So it's obviously referring, so by purity of action, there was purity of existence, which is very important, which is a very important philosophical point. That purity of existence comes from purity of action. In other words, we can't do stupid things or engage in foolish activities and think, yeah, but inside I'm actually pure. Which is interesting because nowadays, because of massive hypocrisy among people claiming to be religious, there has arisen in our culture, actually around the world now, a sort of a somewhat cynical idea that I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm not into religion, but I'm spiritual. In other words, so if you take spirituality, well, as it's taken in this crude popular notion that somehow spirituality refers to internal states, like inside I'm really pure. And if you take religion in this popular idea to mean external observable behavior, like let's say in a context of bhakti yoga, getting up at a certain time, going engage in certain worship in a temple or in one's temple at home, refraining from sinful activities, and so on. So religion, in this popular and somewhat ignorant popular notion. External behavior, that's just religion. Like, I don't have to practice anything. I don't have to refrain from anything because inside I'm spiritual. The problem with this is that, first of all, it simply is a mask that covers gross hypocrisy. And also, distinction between religiosity and spirituality is based on an obvious mistake, which is that if you are in a higher state of consciousness, that will in no way manifest in your actual behavior. That internal states, spiritual states, don't influence behavior, which is absurd. Which is absurd because obviously, if you're seeing the world as the property of God, why would you try to jump all over it and exploit it? And similarly, if you actually were in a spiritual state of attachment to God or Krishna, why wouldn't you want to worship him? Why wouldn't you want to sing songs about him or go to see him in the temple? But anyway, to this verse, interestingly, because this knowledge is eternal, and therefore it's actually relevant at all times and places. And so we have juxtaposed here, not only in two compound words, but actually juxtapose these two sentences are next to these two words are next to each other. Evam karma vishuddha vishuddha. It's the same word. Actually, well, technically it's vishuddha is an adjective and vishuddhi is a noun. It's the same thing. It's like saying purified and purification in English. So evam karma. So by purification or purity of action, uh, manifested purity of existence. We pure. And actually, Krishna talks about this also in chapter 5 of the Bhagavad Gita, where he says that Sankhya Yogao Pratag Bala Pravadanti na Pandita, where Krishna says that Sankhya and yoga. Sankhya and yoga are introduced as terms. They're very typical. It's typical terminology of the Sankhya yoga system. Krishna introduces this in verse 39 of chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, where he says that, oh my God, Krishna is, what is that? Isatya Bihita Sankhya Buddhir Yoge Dhimangshanu. Where Krishna is in chapter 2 of the Gita, which Prabhupada titles, he puts the title, the contents of the Gita summarized. In other words, chapter 2 is a summary of the entire Bhagavad Gita, and therefore it's, deserves our attention. And in this chapter 2, Krishna divides the chapter in verse 239, which is roughly halfway through. And he introduces this terminology. He says, Esha Te Bihita Sankhya Buddhi. He says, what I've just explained to you. So if you know the Gita in chapter 2, Krishna begins his teaching by laying down basic ontology. Ontology in philosophy means the philosophy of existence itself. And Krishna basically teaches there are two kinds of real things in the world. There are two kinds of real things in the world, which are eternal things and temporary things. In other words, things, as he says, oh my God, why am I so rusty today? Nasato vidite bhavo, that of the asat, there's no real existence. Nasato vidite, and na bhavo vidite sataha, and there's never any real non-existence of that which is eternal. Ubayora pi drishto antas. Twaniyos Tattvadarshi Vihi. The Tattvadarshis, and this is a very important word, Tattvadarshi, the word Tattva, because the word Tattva is often translated as truth, but actually it's a specific word for truth. If you just mean tell the truth, don't lie, that's another word. That's Satyam. Satyam. But if you mean a categorical truth, in other words, a fundamental, a real thing, that's Tattva. And I'll explain even more about this. If you can't stand it anymore, all this Sanskrit grammar, just, raise your hand or something. But the word tattva is a very interesting word because tat in Sanskrit, we still have in English. English just added an H for some bizarre reason. So in English, it's the word that. So if you just take tut and put an H in, it's English. So tut and twa means the state of being. So tattva literally means the state of being that. And so that is a demonstrative pronoun in English. Tat in Sanskrit is a demonstrative pronoun, just like that in English. So a demonstrative pronoun is literally something that demonstrates something out. And you can only point out a real thing. You can't point out something that doesn't exist. And therefore, tat comes to mean in Sanskrit shorthand or in Sanskrit philosophical jargon, a real thing, something that actually exists and therefore can be demonstrated. As in Om Tat Sat. That's what it means in Om Tat Sat. That ultimately, Om, the Lord, is the real thing, Sat, that exists eternally. That's actually what Om Tat Sat means. So, when you say Tattva, a real thing, so it can mean a fundamental category of real things, as in Vishnu Tattva, or Jiva Tattva, or Prakriti Tattva, the three fundamental categories of real things. So, so Krishna says that by explaining that some things have always existed and always will exist, and other things did not exist in the past, exist now, and always will, and exist now and will not exist in the future. These are the only two categories. These and in fact, the proof that these are the only two categories, if you're talking about the temporal nature of real things. In other words, how do real things exist in time? How do real things exist in time? And Krishna explains they only exist in two ways. Always existed, always will exist. Didn't exist, exist now, and won't exist in the future. And to emphasize, you could say, or as an emphasis of the fact, these are the only two categories of the temporal dimension, the time of real things. Krishna includes himself in the same category as jivas in this limited sense of time, because he says, Natevaham jatu nasam. Never did I not exist, natwam, nor you. So if we're talking about the kinds of or the ways that real things exist in time, they only exist in real ways. Destroy the foolish spiritual body didn't exist in the past, but what is given to us by Bhakti Devi, who, by the way, is not an actual person in our Shastras, it's just a poetic device. Anyway, that when we get pure devotional service, then our spiritual body will exist forever. This is impossible according to the Gita, because that would add a third kind of thing which Krishna rejects, namely something which didn't exist in the past, comes to exist, and then exists forever. There is no such thing. So therefore, the idea that our spiritual body didn't exist, but now it comes to exist, it's just some foolishness coming from people that obviously have too much time on their hands and don't spend that time enough philosophically. So, but getting back to the point here, I thought I should mention that. Getting back to the point of verse 239, and then coming back to this verse, Krishna says that everything is just taught. so far in chapter 2 is buddhi, rational spiritual intelligence. This is something very important, just like we're doing a little philosophy right now, which won't hurt you. Maybe increase your appetite for breakfast. So, but actually, Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita that what he's giving us in the Gita is spiritual, rational intelligence. And and to be rational in Krishna consciousness, I mean, you don't have to be a technical philosopher, but you do have to be reasonable. And it's so important that Krishna says in verse 10:10 that Teshang, for them, Satata Yuktanam, who are always linked to me in Krishna consciousness, Bhajatang, and who are worshiping me, Priti Purvakam, putting devotion first. That's what Purvaka actually means. Purva means first, and Ka means putting something first. So Priti Purvakam means putting first, or giving priority to, or emphasizing love. Teshang satata juktanang bhajatang priti purvakam dadami. Krishna says, I give those people something, jena mamupajanti, by which they come to me. So what does Krishna give devoted souls that enables them to come to me? Interestingly, Krishna says buddhi yogam, the practice of spiritual rationality. So actually, this is not jnana yoga in the jargon of our tradition, because jnana yoga, it means that you depend upon your own brain, which is not a good bet. But in this, what Krishna is describing is that if you are devoted, if you are putting love first, if you are making that the priority, then I will give you spiritual intelligence, spiritual reason. And so this verse confirms what Krishna says in chapter 5 of the Gita, where he says that Sankhya Yoga Pratak Bala Pravadanti Pandita, that the literally childish, Bala means child, like Bala Krishna, but it's also used in Sanskrit to mean someone who's immature, someone who's just childish. And so Krishna says, Bala, those who are childish, Pravadanti, they claim that, or they assert that Sankhya and Yoga, philosophy and practice are different or separate. So this is the point that I'm getting to in this verse of the Bhagavatam, that claim they're separate. And again, going back to 239, Krishna says what I've just explained to you is Bhuti, Sankhya, which means in a philosophical context, and there's Yoga Trimangshu, and your Bhuti practice. To summarize, the whole Bhagavad Gita is just teaching Buddhi in philosophy and practice. And of course, ultimately, Buddhi means to surrender to Krishna. Because if you don't surrender to Krishna, you're not fully rational. But anyway, so here in this verse, just as Krishna says, the childish claim that philosophy and practice are different. Na pandita, not the wise. The wise don't say that because Ekamapi asti tak samyag. If you really stick to one of these fully, ekama, that's literally what it means actually. Ekamapi asti tak samyag. If you stick to one of these fully, ubayor vindate phalam. You achieve the fruits of both. In other words, if you really devote yourself to understanding Krishna and studying Shastra, this will lead you to engage in devotional service. And of course, if it doesn't lead you, you didn't get it. You didn't understand it. But if you really understand Shastra, when you engage in loving service to Krishna. And even if someone is not philosophical, if they sincerely engage in loving service to Krishna, they will understand Krishna consciousness. So now, coming to this verse, just in case you thought that because of my age, I forgot what the original topic was. So to refute any such notion, going back to this verse, where it says, Evam karma vishuddhya vishuddha sattvasyanta. So these two words are put together, vishuddhya, vishuddha. In other words, by purity of action, there's purity of existence. And of course, purity of existence, then you understand everything, because your existence as a soul is purity of consciousness. That's what we are. The symptom of our existence as souls is that we're conscious. And so it would be absurd to say, yes, my existence is pure, but my mind is all muddled. I mean, that's really not possible. So if your existence is pure, then your consciousness is pure and you understand everything. So by purity of action, and that's why Prabhupada emphasized that we should practice Krishna consciousness. So Evam karma vishuddhya vishuddha sattvasya. So of Bharata, who had purified existence because of the purity of his actions, antar hridayakasha sarire. And of course, so now all these words that end in E or I, like Sharire, Brahmani, Bhagavati, Vasudeve, Upalakshmi, all these words that end in E or I in this verse are in the locative case in Sanskrit, which means in that. And they are all, oh God, I can't help it, in apposition to, not opposition. In other words, they are actually describing, they're simply describing, Krishna. Because the idea is that of Bharata, devotion arose. That's, I mean, we would say devotion, that devotion arose in him or something, but in Sanskrit you say of him. So devotion arose of Bharata, devotion unto Krishna, who is all these things. So all these compound words ending in E or I are referring to Krishna. They're all in the locative case. It means in Krishna, whose body, whose spiritual form is within the sky of the heart. Whoops. Oh, still there? Yeah. The sky of the heart. Interesting, isn't it? Hridaya Akasha. Akasha means, or in the space of the heart, because the heart, we're not talking about the bloody pump, the physical pump. And therefore, Akasha means in the space of the heart, just like Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita 15:15, that how does that begin? Mataksmiti Jnana Sarvasyaham Hridi Sannivesha. Whoops, I was thinking the other word. Ishvara Hriddeshe Arjuna Tishtati. Sarvasya Chamriti Sannivishta. Oh, it's the other one. Ishvara Sarvabhutanam Hriddeshe. That's the words I was thinking. That Krishna says in I think it's in 1861 that I am in the region of the heart. Hriddesha. Desha means a place. So Hriddeshe. And here it said Hridayakasha, in the space of the heart, not in the physical heart. Krishna explains this by way in the first several verses of chapter 9 of the Gita, how he's in all living beings, but he's not in them. Because he's in them, but not in physical space. That's also explained in chapter 9 of the Gita. So devotion arose for Krishna, whose own spiritual form is in the space, within the space of the heart. Brahmani, Krishna, who is the absolute truth, Brahman, Bhagavati, Krishna, who is Bhagavan, the Lord, Vasudeva, Mahapurusha Rupa Upalakshane, Krishna, who can be identified by the characteristic that he has the form of the great person, Mahapurusha Rupa. He has the beautiful form of the great person, literally. And also, and he's there in that form with the Gadavir is the instrumental form, Krishna with Srivatsa, that particular mark on his chest, Kostuba, particular gem he wears, Vanamala, a garland, mala of vana, of forest flowers or wild flowers. That's how you say in Sanskrit, a garland of wildflowers. And Aridara Gada, and a club which literally pulverizes or smashes his enemies, the bad guys. So he's got all these things. He's got all this paraphernalia, Srivatsa, Kostuva, uh, garland of wildflowers, and a club that smashes demons. And so actually then Upalakshite, actually Krishna, again, he developed Bharata devotion for Krishna, who has these symptoms or characteristics or distinguishing marks of all these things, Srivata, Kaustubha, and so on. So that's how the verse actually goes. Nija Purusha Hrid Likitain Atmani, in Krishna, who is the soul, who is, you could say, Nija Purusha Hrid Likitena, who is visualized in Likita, can mean written or it can mean manifested. But here it's referring to Krishna's presence in the heart of his own people. Nija means his own. So Nija Purusha, his own people. Very interesting. Or it's also this expressed in Sanskrit in other verses as Swajana, his own people. Swa and Nija are synonyms. So it's very interesting. And although Krishna emphasizes in the Gita, emphasizes in Bhagavatam, Krishna is equal to everyone. He doesn't discriminate. He reciprocates perfectly with everyone. And yet the devotees are his people. Why? Because they accept him in a very special way. So Krishna also accepts them in a special way. So at the same time, Krishna is absolutely fair and equal to everyone. And yet he has his own people who are the devotees. And it's almost like saying that with a form, Krishna with his form in the heart of the devotees is inscribed in their hearts. So literally, I mean, it's poetic, of course, and you could also say that poetically in English, like you are inscribed in my heart, or you are engraved in my heart, and that's actually what it means. Literally, it's a poetic thing that he developed devotion for Krishna, who, by his beautiful form, is inscribed in the hearts of the form of it, in the hearts of his devotees. That's literally what it means. And Virochamane, Krishna, who is shining, who is effulgent, who is Virochamane means like just shining in a very beautiful, brilliant way. Uchais Taram. So Uchais Taram means very powerful, or so very powerful bhakti. Anu Dinam, day after day. Dina means day, and Anu means following. So day after day. Day after day, Edamana Raya, this bhakti, Edamana Raya, this increasing with that bhakti, which had increasing force. It was becoming more powerful every day. Ajayata arose for Bharata. So I've gone over the simple grammar of this verse, and you're still somehow alive. So it wasn't lethal. It wasn't a lethal dose of grammar. Of course, we don't know. We have to see if you make it through the day. Anyway, I find it interesting. So I made one point about Krishna, about how by the purity of action, there's purity of existence. And just like any normal, decent person doesn't sit down in a filthy seat, right? If you say you go into some place where you're going to sit down, like a Vedic multiplex with all kinds of movies. So, but if you're going to sit down and you see that a particular chair or seat is filthy, is dirty, you're not going to sit there, right? So in the same way, Krishna doesn't manifest in the heart, in a filthy heart, in a dirty heart. Krishna hangs out in clean places. And so if our heart is pure, then Krishna will take his seat there and he will manifest to us. But it's just natural. It's like if you're walking down the street and you see some crazy person, like, first of all, crazy people are dangerous. So people tend to avoid crazy people. If someone's crazy and really very active or swinging their arms or just running around, and people just get out of the way. But in general, we don't like, I mean, unless you're some kind of clinical person or you're professionally trained, most people, if you see a crazy person in the street, just go the other way. And it's not that you go up to them and say, "Hi, can we talk? My name is Philip. What's your name?" So, so in the same way, Krishna is not going to associate with crazy people. And not to surrender to Krishna is basically crazy. And it's even said that's even said in the Bhagavatam, because in the Bhagavatam, many times a person who's in material consciousness is described as matta, crazy. That's where we get the word mad. An English verb is mad, M-A-D, or you pronounce it mud in Sanskrit, but it's the word mad. And matta means like mad, and maddened or something. So we we are trying to persuade Krishna to accept us into his association. And we serve Krishna because if you love someone, that's what you do. It's like if some young guy becomes very attached to some young girl, and he takes about a month to get up his courage to ask her out, fear of rejection. So then let's say he asks this girl out, and he's just like, his heart is beating. Oh, I just hope she'll say yes. But what's he really doing? He's like begging this person, please let me spend money on you. Please let me, take you out to dinner or lunch or something. Please let me spend money on you. Please let me serve you. So he's sort of begging for service. Of course, this, in most cases, is a perverted reflection. But the point is that reflections do give us some reliable information. For example, let's say you see an apple tree reflected in the clear surface of a pond. It's not a real apple tree. You can't really eat the reflected apples, but it does tell you exactly what an apple tree looks like. We always kind of talk about the bad parts of reflections, that it's not real, but it does show you exactly what apple trees look like. So in the same way, this world, for all of its madness, does show you what the spiritual world is. It's just that, like you can't eat the reflection of an apple, you can't enjoy the reflection of love. You can't enjoy the reflection of real life. And therefore, if let's say I'm walking along, my head is down, and I see the reflection of an apple tree, what do? Well, if I'm hungry, I look up and I see there's the real tree and those are the real apples. So in that way, if you pay attention to this world, We don't just reject it with dry renunciation. We learn from it. We learn from it what the spiritual world is. And that's why the Upanishad says in this amazing verse, Vidyang cha justad vedo bhayang saha, one who knows both knowledge and unknowledge. That's how you say ignorance in Sanskrit. Actually, ignorance is Sanskrit because the gnosis, ignore, means not to ignore, which is a Sanskrit gyan. So it's actually the Greek from the Sanskrit. But in Sanskrit, you say knowledge and unknowledge, or ignorance. So the Upanishad says that one who knows both knowledge and unknowledge, avidyaya, by unknowledge, by ignorance, mrityum tirtva, crossing over death. So obviously, this is what I call a literary speed bump. Because if you're reading this and you're not just kind of, I don't know, sort of a pious airhead, but you're actually paying attention to what you're reading, then you're going to think, what? I'm going to cross over death by ignorance? That's what it says. Avidyaya, by unknowledge, by ignorance, mrityum, death, tirtva, crossing over, vidyaya, by knowledge, amritam, immortality, ashnute, one achieves. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, you have to know that in Sanskrit philosophical jargon, that avidya just means the material world. It's just ignorance. That's just synonym for the material world because it's nothing but ignorance. So therefore, avidya means by understanding the material world. Let's say someone is like really dry, because some people, even in non-Vaishnavas and actually occasionally Vaishnavas, their attitude toward romance is really dry. It's like, it's just like the categorical yuck. You know, they don't want anything to do with that. And so what's wrong with that attitude? Well, if that's all, if it's just total yuck, or then it's not real knowledge. Because real knowledge is that, okay, in this world, if I try to enjoy romantic love, I'm going to end up, you know, with a lot of pie on my face. But uh, this, these emotions are pointing to a pure version of this, a pure version. Sometimes I say, well, you know, there are some sannyasis who are actually sannyasis because they're the most romantic. And what I mean by that is that if you actually understand spiritual love, if you actually understand spiritual romance, then you don't settle for something inferior. And anyway, I don't want to be one of those sannyasis that tries to sabotage grihastha life. But ultimately, ultimately, I think someone who has never experienced anything like romantic love, or let's say someone who has experienced it, even if it's a perverted reflection or all that, they can then extrapolate, well, imagine if there was a pure version of this. So in that sense, even material romantic love is very educational. And because it shows that the truth is not just impersonal, but actually there is a world where there's perfect romance, where there's perfect love. And not only between Krishna and the gopis, because, I mean, I think it's fair to assume that Nanda and Yasoda actually like each other. I mean, they're a couple. And it's not like, I just want you to know that I have no personal feelings for you, but merely as a duty, I will agree to be your wife, or I will agree to be your husband. I mean, in the spiritual world, they actually like each other. And for example, we know that Nanda and Yasoda in a previous life, or Vasudeva and Devaki, they wanted Krishna as a child. And so for many lives, they practiced advanced yoga together as a couple. So So therefore, and not only that, so to understand the material world means you have to understand two basic things about it. Number one, it is a very imperfect reflection of of the spiritual world. But number two, it is a reflection. And therefore, by studying this world intelligently, we can actually understand the spiritual world. So this involves sort of, advanced abilities in studying psychology. For example, you can examine your own heart. You can examine your own feelings and see that, okay, I have this almost like, I don't know, almost hallucinogenic attachment to someone in the opposite sex and all these dreams of, and all that. But okay, it's perverted. So, but what is perverted about it? The fact that, let's say, a male and a female, feel mutual affection, that's not the perversion. That's actually natural. So, to be more explicit, what is the perversion? It's the desire to exploit it. It's the desire to take Krishna's place. But obviously, it's possible to experience romantic love without wanting to take Krishna's place, without wanting to be the center, without wanting to be God. And so therefore, avidyaya mrityum tirtva, that one crosses over death by understanding this world, comparing it to the spiritual world. And of course, you need to be sufficiently advanced spiritually to know the difference between purity and impurity. If we and So it's actually a spiritual science. Therefore, it's emphasized in many places. You really have to be smart. You really have to be intelligent to come to an advanced understanding of Krishna consciousness. It's not just sort of, just some basic thing. Ooh, that Maya. Ooh, that Krishna. It's which is kind of the neophyte approach. So anyway, um, so any other questions about this? Sarvatma Ji.
According to your description, think that one thing that was why and following her.
The what?
I was following her, believing that you know her.
Well, not necessarily. For example, oh, it seems then that some devotees don't really understand the difference between Falgu Vairagya, which means literally trivial renunciation, where you're just giving up something which is not really that bad. You just didn't understand it. And Yukta Vairagya, which means renunciation, which is done for the sake of serving Krishna. Um, in a neophyte stage, one doesn't have the luxury sometimes of Yukta Vairagya, because you can't just declare that, okay, for example, a guy, I'm attached to this girl, but now I'm just going to transform that into pure spiritual love. Well, you know, not not so easy. So if I have strong material desires and want to embrace something, sometimes literally, want to embrace something in Krishna's service, then I may be overcome. In other words, I may not strong enough spiritually overcome material attachment, and I may become degraded. So I remember when I first joined the Hare Krishna movement. I mean, literally, the first time I went on Harinam, and we were doing Harinam in Telenu in Berkeley, which is sort of the main student street in Berkeley. And it was bewildering, because there I was on the same street where I had engaged in non-devotional activities for several years. And So I remember the only safe place for my eyes was on the sweatshirt of the brahmachari in front of me. Because, we were like little duckies. We were all in a row. And we had our little, saffron sweatshirts and dhotis, which, is kind of humiliating. But anyway, so we were going down Telegraph Avenue, and if my mind looked anywhere else, it was just too much. So I just had to meditate on that saffron, which I can still see in my mind. And then after a few days, I kind of, even Plato talks about this in his famous analogy of the cave, that if someone comes out of the dark cave into the sunlight, and the sun, of course, in Plato represents God and the truth. So if someone comes out of the cave into the sun, at first, his eyes are not adjusted. And so in a sense, he can't even see as well as he did in the cave. It's kind of, but then his eyes adjust. But so that's really the science of Krishna consciousness. What am I able to engage in service, and what is going to really be too much for me? How much weight can I lift? And if I lift too much weight, I'm going to end up, really hurting myself. So as we advance, that's why it's interesting, because some people believe that, some devotees believe that the more advanced you are, the more you separate yourself from the fruit of workers. Is that we allowed to say? Karmi, I know, is not politically correct anymore, which is really a shame, because it's really a nice philosophical word. But I guess it was kind of misused, so it was anyway.
Aren't we the only ones that know what that means, though? I mean, it's kind of like Islamese.
Yeah, it's our jargon, yes. So anyway, so yeah, but some people think, and then we'll go to you, John. But some devotees think that the more advanced you are, the more you separate yourself in the world. You have to always dress differently, always do everything differently. And actually, our philosophy is exactly the opposite. Because if you look at the three adhikaris, like Uttamadhikari, the highest position, Madhyam, the middle position, Kanishta, which literally means the lowest in Sanskrit. For you historical linguistics fans, even the ST in English, which means superlative, like lowest, highest, finest, that's Sanskrit actually. Because Sanskrit is superlative, like Kanishta. So Kanishta, MST, fine. Anyway, back to that. So three adhikaris, Kanishta, whom the Bhagavatam says is on the material platform. So Bhakta Prati, not a liberated devotee. The symptom is that person cannot see Krishna in the hearts of devotees, and therefore cannot establish friendship with devotees, and cannot see Krishna in the hearts of all other beings, and therefore is incapable of establishing real spiritual friendship. These things, Archayame Vaharaye, anyway, that's the verse. So, whereas the Madhyamadikari begins to connect with the world, because the Madhyamadikari, of course, worships Krishna as the Lord, and makes friendship, real friendship with other devotees, and is merciful to non-devotees. So therefore, it's the Madhyamadikari, the preacher, the person who's trying to spread Krishna consciousness, that returns to the world, that doesn't reject the world, and forms friendship with the world, is kind. And so an act of kindness is to make people feel comfortable with you. That's an example of an act of kindness, that you make people comfortable in your presence. You don't emphasize how different you are from them. You emphasize that we have a lot in common. So let's talk about Krishna. You let people identify with you. By you showing empathy with them, you open a space where they can identify with you. In fact, Krishna says in the Gita, the highest yogi is the one who had the devotee, it really means, or the highest devotee is the one who has universal empathy. The exact verse is Atmopamyena Sarvatra. By comparing everyone else to oneself, like Jesus said, to love theologically sophisticated verses, theologically and even poetically sophisticated verses are spoken by women. So if the idea really is that women are less intelligent, why are many, like I said, the most literarily and theologically sophisticated statements, why are they spoken by women? Secondly, we always where women are more intelligent than their husbands. In the Bhagavatam, the wise Bhagavatam doing that. For example, the wise of Kaliya, who are obviously much more intelligent than he was. Another example, the wives of the Brahmanas. When Krishna's cowherd friends were hungry and Krishna said, these Brahmanas doing a sacrifice, there's a lot of prasadam left over, and the Brahmins were foolish. The cowherd boys came back frustrated, as we are when, prasadam's not there on time. It's one of the great miseries of Bhakti Yoga, prasadam's late. So Krishna said, go back and ask their wives. So they went back, and the wives, of course, they were just in ecstasy, and they literally clean out their kitchen, their pantries, take everything to Krishna. Now, what's very interesting about this story is the following. And one thing you have to understand, as I always explain, is that Krishna was in this world for 125 years. So if you multiply 125 by 365, I forgot the number, that's a very big number. That's how many days Krishna was here. I think it's very safe to say that every day Krishna did many very interesting things. I don't think Krishna had taken the day off, no pastimes for himself. What that means is that Krishna executed tens of thousands of pastimes. Therefore, the pastimes that made the final cut into the Bhagavatam, extremely selective. It's like some prestigious Ivy League school where they accept, 3% of the applicants. Well, guess what? All Krishna's pastimes on earth, the pastimes that made it into the Bhagavatam, are just a tiny fraction of 1%. What that means is there's a very, very high level of intentionality. It wasn't like, okay, what pastimes for the Bhagavatam? I don't know, just, whatever you got handy there. No, these were very, very intentionally selected. So one of the pastimes that was very, very intentionally selected is that the wives of the Brahmins are much more intelligent than their husbands. Not only that, but every imaginable, practically, male authority figure tells them not to go. Husbands, grown sons, brothers, I don't know, life coaches. I mean, every male authority figure orders them not to go, and basically they say to the men, "Eat prasadam," and they just go anyway. They go any philosophical point. Example: it's from the Mahabharata, where Pandu wants to have more and more sons. It's like for a king, it's the ultimate collectible, a son. And so after the 5 Pandavas are born, Pandu starts pressuring his wife, please call more devas, we need more sons. And also because the life expectancy of a Kshatriya is often not very high. So you need sons. So Kunti says, no, do you want me to, every deva in heaven? And so she says, what are people going to say about me? So she says, no, it's inappropriate. And then Pandu quotes this verse, which I'm sure some of the chauvinists quote. Pandu says, a woman must obey her husband whether he's right or wrong. A woman must obey her husband whether he's right or wrong. Now, the interesting point, Kunti say in reply, she basically says, in your dreams. So then Kunti gives her arguments, and what does Pandu say? As they say, husband always gets the last word. Yes, dear. I'm not saying that the woman's always right. I'm not going to the other extreme. I'm not saying women should, never, listen to their husbands. But in this case, Pandu explicitly quotes that a wife has to follow her husband, whether he's right or wrong. And she says, in your dreams. And then she gives her arguments, and he says, okay. That, in other words, in Vedic culture, they're real people. If they didn't get divorced, it's because there was give and take. Because if you have a culture where the men are always right, either it's like sort of radical Muslim culture where they kill women that don't obey, or it doesn't exist. I mean, here's another example. In the Bhagavatam, Sudama Brahman, him and his wife are, they're almost starving because they're just faithful brahmanas that, and they're following their brahmana dharma, and there's no income. So the wife says, Sudama's wife says, your old friend is Krishna. He's the richest person in the world. Why don't you go see your friend? And Sudama says, no, I don't want to do that. What happens? He goes. So if you look at the scriptures not through the eyes of just sort of, fanatical chauvinism, which is a disgusting state of consciousness, then you'll find these were real people. They had real marriages. And in real marriages, there's give and take. They're real people. Another thing is, perhaps I could mention here, since I'm doing this thing now, is that in Shastra, let us say, which is all we know about Vedic culture, men do not call women mother. They don't call, and Mataji, they certainly don't call women Mataji because that's not even Sanskrit. It's Hindi. I mean, the G is Hindi. In Sanskrit, if you were addressing your mother, you would say mater. It shows the English Sanskrit, say mater. It's like if you were addressing your brother, brother. That's Sanskrit. So I actually looked up every case in the Bhagavatam where a man speaks to a woman that's not his wife, and they don't call them mother. First of all, they often call them by their names. And of course, there's a Hindu superstition that even if a man calls his wife by her name, I don't know, his ears will fall off, or something really bad will happen, or he'll be he'll be run over by a plow or something. But so actually, if you read the Bhagavatam to find out what Vedic culture actually is, men often call women by their names. Women actually have names, and even if they are, being more formal, where, sometimes informal, like you could say, let's say if I don't know a woman, I say, excuse me, ma'am. And so we have things like ma'am or lady or sir. So they have that in Sanskrit. Sometimes, there are more formal addresses, but it's not mother. When they're addressing women more formally, they will say something like the vocative form of padra, which means like good lady, which is padre, just like radha, and the vocative is radhe. So it means you're addressing the person. So they will say padre shubhe shubha means auspicious or fine or beautiful. So shubhe, padre, or their name, not mother. Even in the Vedas, for example, in the oldest Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there are two women, Maitreyi, Igargi, two women who are gurus, by the way. And you find discussions where these two female gurus are having debates with some of the authors of the Vedas. For example, Yajurveda Yajnavalkya is one of the speakers of the four Vedas. And there's a woman who's debating with him. Discussion. And she makes good points. There were women who were gurus to kings. There were kings who sat at the feet of women who were gurus. So we have to look at what real Vedic culture is. Yes. So we'll go down the line. Yes. Uh-oh, I think they're going to fight over it now. Just kidding. Oh, by the way, one last thing, and then we'll go to the questions, and that is like, what were women like in Vedic culture? Well, we can find out in scripture. For example, uh, one interesting thing, if you read the Mahabharata, the unabridged, not just the comic books or the summaries, and that is that they had vacation places for the residents of Dwarka. Their sort of vacation spot was Raivataka Mountain, and they would go there vacation. Went there, and they would actually have evening shows, like with comedians, dancers, singers. Like they would have variety shows at night. These are real people. And in Indraprastha, when the Pandavas were in Indraprastha, one of their main vacation places, especially for summer. I mean, literally, they would take summer vacation. They're not so different from us. They would take summer vacations, and they would go down to the river. They had this place by the river. So it's described when Krishna was visiting Indraprastha, the they had wrestling tournaments. The interesting point here is the wrestling matches were among the women. So, what were Vedic women? Well, among other things, they had wrestling matches. Or, for example, Krishna's own sister, uh, it turns out, was expert at driving a war chariot. So, how is that? She's a Mataji, just kidding. And yet, so when Krishna when Arjuna was eloping with Subhadra, because the Yadavas were attacking because they didn't show respect and get their blessings and all that. So I mean, no one was killing anyone else; they were just kind of shooting. But so because Arjuna had to fend off the Yadus, Subhadra turned out was expert at driving a war chariot. So the point I'm trying to make is, and just one more point, and we'll take questions. Like, what's going on here? Why do we have this impression of Vedic culture, which in many ways is very different than real Vedic culture? Because national character changes. So you can't look at India and think you're seeing Vedic culture. In some ways you are. I mean, worshiping Krishna and not killing animals. Some ways you are, but in many ways you're not. Or to give an example from the West, if you look at the Romans when they had their republic and even their empire, these were like super machos. I mean, for example, their own origin story, like their own sort of myth about where we all come from, is that the god of war, Mars, begot Romulus and Remus in a she-wolf. I mean, you can't get macho than that. The god of war begot the founders of Roman civilization in a she-wolf. I mean, these are these are very masculine guys, and they were great engineers. Like, for example, if you read, I mean, reliable ancient Roman historians who actually are considered good historians, the Romans territory, they came to the Rhine, huge river, and they had to cross it with hundreds, if not thousands, of tons of wagons and supplies and soldiers. So they built a bridge strong enough to carry all this incredible weight. And how long did it take them to build the bridge? 24 hours. So these are like super like engineers, warriors, and yet over time you get Italy, make love not war. Actually, Italy saved because Mussolini, in his agreement with Hitler, was supposed to take over the southern countries and Hitler the north. But the Italians didn't want to fight; they weren't into it, and so it's just they kept losing the battle. They weren't into it. So Hitler had to send German troops to North Africa and the Mediterranean, and because he had to send troops, it delayed his invasion of Russia, and therefore the Nazis were wiped out by the Italians. You know, and if you look at Italian products, they're domestic. Food, furniture, fashion. So if you look at the Italian culture, it goes from this super hyper macho on steroids culture to a country that's not into war. The Romans were super organizers. They built their empire not just by bullying everyone; they were actually brilliant at at uh, at at forming teams and getting people to. And yet, Italy then became the most disunited country in Europe with city states. They were unable to form a larger political body than a city. So, what I mean to say is, if in, let's say, 2,000 years or less, actually, let's say from the time when Romans were still kind of like Romans before it became something else, uh, in 1,000 years, in 1,000 years, the culture of Italy went to the exact opposite. What happened to India in 5,000 years? So therefore, if you look at India today, or the last 1,000 years, or last, in terms of attitudes toward women, attitudes toward caste, attitudes toward many things, it's not a window in every sense. And I think this sort of non-critical uh, sort of, assumption that, oh, everything in India is Vedic is, I think in some ways, we're learning culture from India. In some ways, I think it's causing all kinds of trouble in Islam. And so, therefore, if we look at Shastra, we find out what people really did back then. And what I find interesting is that with certain obvious differences, they were kind of like us. They were real people. And marriages were just sort of real marriages between men and women. And women, certain women, in fact, there's one sannyasi in ISKCON that's been preaching, I won't mention his name, fortunately, I hope not here, that we caste, only men have caste. Can't think of anything because the whole first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, all of Arjuna's arguments are that we should avoid Varna Sankara, which Prabhupada translates as unwanted progeny. But what literally means Varna mixing. That's what the word literally means, Varna mixing. And if you read the Manu Samhita, actually most of it is mostly concerned with avoiding Varna mix. And so if women don't have a Varna, how can you have a mixed marriage? Pratiloma, or improper Varnas. And so therefore, to say women are this, women are that, it doesn't really make sense. It's not precise, it's not scientific, because a Brahmana woman can be a genius, she can be brilliant, a philosopher, as many of them were. A great female philosopher who speaks in the Vedas, speaks philosophy in the Vedas. And so, anyway, even even scientifically now, there are different kinds of intelligence. It's not really scientific to speak of intelligence in the singular. There's mathematical intelligence. There's emotional. Women tend to have greater emotional intelligence than men. Men tend to have more mathematical. Not intelligence. Women are less inclined. People become good at things they like. Much fewer women are excited by, let's say, things like metallurgy or engineering. If they are interested, they can do it very well, but they're not interested. This is science, by the way. This is not chauvinism. And so it depends on what kind of intelligence, artistic intelligence. Yes.
Thank you for the nice Raj, taking on so many points. And so entertaining, actually. So, what I understand, you said that we are intelligent devotee, we intelligently understand the material world, and we'll be able to see the spiritual world from this material world. Anecdotally, I do understand, but if we can help me understand, like maybe there's an apparent contradiction in my mind. Because Krishna says before the Narupam Ashisti Tatupadabhuti, that verse. Na Ananto Nacha Adya
What verse number is that?
3, chapter verse 3.
Okay, let me just get that for a second, and I can give you a very precise sort of 15:3, right?
It's 3 and 4 together. I'm reading the third.
Sinarupamasyeha tato palabhyate. Yes. Sampratisha. Okay, very good point. That's a very good point.
So here, it's an application in my mind, but here, Prabhupada is translating the real form of this tree cannot be the real word, the real tree is how I am understanding is the good.
Okay, so yes.
Where it begins, where its foundation is. So if Krishna is saying we cannot even understand.
Okay, I understand the point. Yeah, the question was that I had mentioned that in the Isopanishad teaches us that we have to understand this world in order to achieve, to cross over death. And yet Krishna seems to be saying here, you can understand this world in this 15:3. Okay. First,
Sorry. Can I just say what I want to say? So, not stand. Actually, the verdict. What I understand is the verdict. Don't waste your time. Next time there's just train at middle Nachitwa. Just cut it.
the point is, okay, but first of all, you should have seen the paradox here. That how can you cut the root if you don't know what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to explain now. First of all, if you look closely, Krishna says, Narupam Asya Iha, the world, this tree is not perceived Iha in the material world. In other words, you have to have higher consciousness. The idea is that if you are not in Krishna consciousness, you have to understand what this world is. But if you are in Krishna consciousness, then you not only understand it, but you know where the root is. If you don't know where it begins and where it ends, how do you know what the root is? Because what Krishna says is that asanga shastri, by the weapon of detachment. But in order to be detached from, you have to know what it is you're being detached from. And so therefore, Krishna is saying, Iha, on the material platform, you can't understand it. And we actually find that. Science doesn't really know what this world is. Even most of the physical world they call dark matter, they don't know what it is. They don't know that it's becoming increasingly difficult even to prove that the laws of nature operate uniformly throughout the universe. So they don't really understand it. Inside the world, it's like they say you can't see the forest for the trees. Inside the forest, you can't see the form of it. And that's what Krishna says, rupam, the complete form of it. If you're inside of something, you can't see the form of it. But if you're detached, then emotionally, you're outside of it. And therefore, you can find where the root is. Because if you really couldn't see the form, because it says you don't know the end of it, you don't know the beginning, but the root is the beginning. So if you say you can't perceive the beginning of it, how do you know what the root is? Therefore, what this verse is actually saying is that in material life, you can't understand it. But if you step outside material life, then you can understand it.
I think you've actually answered everything. So my first question was a major task for Vaishnava traditions is to articulate a value for women that's not dependent on their subservient relationship to men. I think you've clarified that.
Yes, women are valuable because they're eternal souls and they're part of Krishna. Krishna never says in the Gita that, in fact, Krishna says in the Gita that among women, I'm intelligence. What does that mean? I mean, if Krishna's trying to show that women are unintelligent, why does he say among women, I'm intelligence? And so, yeah, the perfection of a woman's life is to love Krishna. That's why we have the story where the women, if they had to choose between following their husbands or serving Krishna, they chose service to Krishna. Just like the wives of Kaliya. They were much more intelligent. They didn't say, "Hey, Kaliya, we're going to throw you a knife here, to help you out." No, they weren't trying to their husband defeat Krishna because they were more intelligent. They chose Krishna.
So then, thank you. So the next question was, I'm kind of studying social activity in India and how it pertains to ISKCON. Um, and this is the caste subgroups seek to ascend the ladder of caste hierarchy by adapting the values and behavior of those at the top. So the Brahmins, so the lower caste are trying to Brahmins, and the Brahmins are imitating, they call it sanctimization or Brahminization. They're taking their way of being from the Puranas, from the scriptures.
First of all, in every society, why do the nouveau riche, why do they buy expensive cars? Why do they try to move into expensive neighborhoods? I mean, that's not just something in India. In every society in the world, people of lower status try to acquire the symbols of higher status. I mean, everyone does that. In the material world, everyone does that in every culture, in every country on earth. As far as first of all, in India nowadays, I mean, who takes Brahmin seriously? It's nowadays, you have to go to IIT or you have to, get hired by some big company in America or Europe. Those are the status symbols now.
Yet they interact, especially with women, they're basing that on, okay, this is how we're supposed to behave. That women are supposed to be lower.
Well, no, but that's not what the Shastra actually teaches.
Right. So
I mean, that's an interpretation of Shastra, but in Shastra we find many brilliant women. We find women who are gurus. We find women who are powerful kshatriyas. I mean, Draupadi that just, whipped Jayadratha in the face, she just, so,
that's my favorite part, by the way.
yes. So, it's not just that someone says this is Vedic, like what's the real culture?
So then that brings me to my third question, which is you talked about, and I really like that, the practice of spiritual rationality. I like that phrase. So we're practicing spiritual rationality, spiritual intelligence to transverse this avidya, this material world. And yet sometimes I find the most irrational people to be devotees. And it's like how
Sorry about that.
this spiritual rationality and intelligence, and yet,
I'll explain it.
okay,
first of all, if you want to say most irrational, that's extremely competitive in this country. Because, I mean, who knew there were that many morons? So, but as far as I think the problem is sometimes that people consciousness and you lord it over. Some oh, sorry about that out there in TV land. So I mean, Prabhupada once said that, I started this movement to attract Brahmins, but many Shudras are joining. So again, in a more advanced state of Krishna consciousness, of course, it's always special to be a devotee of Krishna. It's always special to serve Krishna. But at the same time, it is also partly based on a misunderstanding of the Bhagavatam verse that all good qualities and non-devotees have no good qualities, which is actually not what the Bhagavatam says. And as we know, there are some devotees, our worst nightmare would be to be, trapped on a desert island with some devotees. I mean, that would be our worst nightmare. And we also know, we can just be honest here. And there are some non-devotees who have many good qualities. So I will cite the verse in Sanskrit and explain what it actually means and what it doesn't mean. Asti bhaktir bhagavatya kinchana. One who has pure devotion for the Lord. Yasya, of whom asti there is. Yasya asti bhakti, or devotion, bhagavati, unto the Lord, akinchana, pure. Prabhupada said unalloyed. So one who has unalloyed devotion for the Lord, sarvair gunais tatra, with all good qualities, samasata, that person resembles the devas, the godly beings, with in all qualities. But harav avaktasya, harav means in Hari. One who is not devoted to Hari, harav avaktasya, kuto maharaguna. How can that person, like a rhetorical question, like how can that person have the qualities of pure devotees? Not devotees, not anyone that puts on a dhoti and washes a pot. But how can that person have the qualities of Mahad, of the great souls, the pure devotees who were just mentioned? Harava bhaktasya kuto mahadguna, because manoratena asati dhavato, but the person is literally running outside temporary realm. So what this verse actually says is that those who have no devotion for the Lord cannot have. It does not say they have no good qualities. It does not say any devotee has all good qualities. And so, as we know, there are some devotees who, if they have good qualities, they keep them very well hidden. And there are non-devotees who are generous, kind, uh, pleasant to be around, and so on. Idea, it's led perhaps in some people a type of arrogance. I'm a devotee, I have all good qualities, even though I'm one of the most obnoxious people on the face of the earth. And so, so I think we have to just be a little realistic here and look at what the Shastra actually says. On the line here, and then you after that. Yes.
Before you explain about Priti Purvaka, that attachment should be first, and then Krishna gives us knowledge. But what if I don't have Priti? What am I supposed to do to achieve the desired?
You should, yes. You should give me a donation, and then I will give you. Now, in that case, because you don't have Priti, and what that can mean, Priti Purvakam, is that in your own life, you place as your main goal in life to have love of Krishna. Because if you say, okay, at this point, I'm not a great lover of Krishna, but I want to love Krishna, I want to dance, then you are also Priti Purvakam. It doesn't mean you have to have it all now, but you've made that the goal of your life. Hare Krishna. Yes.
I have like 3 points, but I think that they connect together, so maybe you can help me.
We've got a Friday special.
So you said that pure, then Krishna will appear in our heart. And so, from my understanding, devotional service is a process that purify our heart.
Yes.
So I was curious, devotional service, internal or external, or both, and I explained.
Well, if it's let's say if I'm doing some service, I'm not really thinking of Krishna, then how is it devotional? In other words, the word devotional is not just, it's not an institutional description that you're doing service within an institution. It refers to your actual attitude. So if I'm serving without devotion, that's not technically devotional service.
And so I want to go further to the point of like internal service, in terms
Well, if you're in the hospital and can't service, that's, maybe there's no options, but
yeah, I'm thinking more in terms of working on anatta that coming out in the heart. So for example, I noticed that within myself, I have some challenges connecting with devotees because of some anattas and things from the past that sort of along the way. So does that mean that if I do the work to work through these challenges, the blockage, then that is also internal devotional service?
best internal way to work on this is just japa. Because what power do we have? I remember when I first joined the Hare Krishna movement in '69, and the Back to Godhead for that month, had a lecture by Prabhupada. And I remember I read in that article, it's just a new member. Prabhupada said, "You self, only Krishna can purify you." So that way of talking nowadays, like I've got to do the work on that or something, I think what I really need to do is give myself to Krishna, because only Krishna can purify me. If I think that I have the power to save myself, then that's not really devotion. So good japa is all powerful. And so the work is surrender to Krishna. Because the means, there's some verses about this in the Bhagavatam, because the means, the goal are not different. In other words, the goal is loving service to Krishna, but the means is also service to Krishna. So the real work is, begging Krishna, chanting his holy names with real devotion. Please free me from these things, and then Krishna will free you. It's just like that verse that Brahma Yastvindra Gopa Mata Vendra Maho Sakarma Bandhanu Rupa Phalavhanjana Matanoti Karmani Nir Dahati Kintu Cha Bhakti Bhajam Govindamadi Purusham Tamahang Bhajami. That whether you are mighty Indra or just a little insect, Indra Gopa, Krishna literally extends to everyone the acceptance of the fruit of their karma. So we have whatever, let's say, inappropriate emotions we feel. It's just a remnant of our karma. And so, karmani nirdahati kintu bhakti bhajan. For those who really accept him with devotion, Krishna burns up all of that karma. Because that's not really you, obviously. You are a pure soul. And so these moods we can get in, or these feelings we have, material mind, it's not us. And it's the remnant of karma. So the more you really give yourself to Krishna, whether it's in the temple, chanting or serving the deities or doing service, or I don't know, cooking corn on the cob or something, it's like whatever we're doing, Krishna is present, and you can see Krishna there, and you can dedicate that activity to Krishna. And japa is very important. If you do that, Krishna will burn up these other qualities, or gradually.
Yeah.
It's just like when the sun is rising. Krishna compares knowledge to the sun in Gita, Aditya Vadjnanam, knowledge like the sun. So gradually, first you see a little line on the horizon, then more and more light. Of course, Krishna can do anything when he wants, but if we just keep at it, then yes, we'll gradually become purified. You're welcome. So, anything else? Yes, the men. Should we let the men ask questions? No. Oh,
With your second beliefs and non-verbal contribute with etymological meaning of different words. Could you kindly elaborate on the word? Because you mentioned that it is rational, spirituality, pushing, meaning with love. So it's like how much in soul, mind, understanding, or feeling of what love rather is a reflection of love. This is difficult.
love is never ignorant. For example, many people they're in love, but they're in love with it's a disaster. Why is there so much force? Why are crimes of passion? A, a large percentage occur between people that know each other. Crimes of passion. And so what that means is you may feel what you think is love, but if there's not a proper understanding, then it may not be love at all. So I'm not trying to say that love is intellectual. You know, that's not what I meant. What I meant was I love someone because I know them, because I know their good qualities. And if you love someone without really knowing their character, uh, you're in trouble. So it's just like let's say let's say like a boy meets a girl meets a boy. At first, just an acquaintance, and then as you learn about the person, you begin to see this person actually has very good character, the qualities, and love forms. I mean, you find this in Shastra, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. That it's interesting that because I mean Jane Austen in many ways is very Krishna conscious. I gave a lecture on this, and I mean she understands a lot about our philosophy. But in Pride and Prejudice, the themes is that the heroine event she has she she becomes interested in two different men. I mean, there's no illicit sex. There's actually more body parts in the Bhagavatam than in Jane Austen. So I mean, they're very chaste, and so but she becomes interested in two men, and one of them is what we would call in English like this big crush. She gets this crush on the guy, like he's really good looking, he's really a good talker, and really good manners, and she starts to really like him, but it turns out he's a terrible person. And the other thing is with the person that turns out to be the hero of the story, the male hero, Darcy, who at first he doesn't like at all. And that's what the title is, Pride, because the boy and the girl are both proud and prejudiced, and they're both prejudiced against each other. But then when she finally gets over her own prejudice and starts to learn about the qualities of this person, she falls in love with him because she starts to understand his soul, who he really is. And so true love is not stupid. We love Krishna because of his qualities, because of who he is. It's not just love is not merely an emotion. And people, I think some people should get maybe like the gold medal for stupidity. The people that say, no, I'm not in my head chakra, I'm just about my heart chakra or something. I mean, they deserve all the misery they produce for themselves. In fact, Krishna in chapter, I think it's chapter of the Gita, pleasure, the highest happiness. And he says about it, it's the highest pleasure. When a person achieves this, they think there's no greater pleasure. And he says about that pleasure, it is buddhi grahyam, acceptable to rational intelligence. If you, let's say, are in love with someone, it's not that it's just all intellectual. Like, what do you want to do today? Hey, why don't we read the Surah? In other words, love is love. It's a very powerful feeling, but your intelligence has to approve of it. That's the point. So when you feel love for Krishna or you feel love for another devotee, it's not a blind emotion, and it's also not just some intellectual idea. It's a spiritual feeling which can be rationally justified. Yes.
That I'm approaching intellectually because of quality, because it's the best.
That's not intellectual. That's not intellectual. The intellectual part is just it gives you the checklist. But if I see someone that has good qualities, I'm attracted to that person, not intellectually, but that's a good soul. This person is really a good person. This person is kind. This person is generous. This person is intelligent. It's not intellectual, it's personal. It's two people appreciating each other personally, but the intelligence approves of it.
I see difference between the so-called love that people are claiming today, but not this is love and desire. There is so much emphasize it's quite strong.
Because it's not, because it cannot be rationally justified. If you have knowledge, you can't be rational unless you have knowledge. So if you understand life, then how can you justify a relationship with some idiot or a narcissist? You know, they say narcissists are the best salesmen because they have no self-doubt. So it's not intellectual. It's, in other words, let's say, for example, I'm trying to convince myself that this person is worthy. But what's really underneath it is that I have an attachment because I think this person is pretty or, or somehow, or, for some reason, I'm trying to convince myself that this is a good person for me. And so what a person basically does is they shut off their intelligence and they tell themselves a fairy tale. And they end up in a terrible marriage or a terrible relationship. So intelligence means I have to examine our healthy thinking. I may eat some food that really tastes good, but I read what are the ingredients. So I really like this good. Yeah, it has 43 grams of added sugar, or has this much. In other words, you don't just rational people. When you eat, you're not eating as an intellectual experience. You're eating for health. You're eating because it tastes good. But you read the ingredients. You read the label. And so read the label. Because if you're smart and you meet some person, everyone comes with a label. You have to read it. It turns out there are a lot of toxic ingredients. That's what intelligence does. It just tells you whether or not your emotions are reasonable. And if they are reasonable, then you proceed with your emotions. It's the gatekeeper. Hare Krishna. Yes, male-bodied devotee. Yes. That's ISKCON speak. Well, first have to.
Well, it was, I always understand that emotions shut off intelligence.
No, no, because emotions that are acceptable to intelligence, understanding. I love someone because I objectively know who they are, not because I told myself some stupid story about the person to justify my animal attraction. Emotions don't shut off intelligence. Attach shuts off intelligence. For example, let's say I'm on an interstate and I see no obstacles, there's very little traffic, the road conditions are good, the equipment is dry, I can go high speed. Before I go high speed, out the road conditions. It's very simple. Yes.
Thank you, Art, for sharing your wisdom on that thing. The question back to what you were saying earlier about preach. When you described the Adhikar, particularly about Madhyana Adhikar, that the preacher is trying to what's more common.
Let me different adhikaris that madhyam adhikaris in common.
That's what I'm trying. Yeah.
Well, not only points in common, points. Well, yeah, you try to connect with the person, but also you have to understand this is the soul. This is the soul, and you have to like people.
Yes. And so my question, I've been participating in Binance benefit interfaith dialogue with the organization. They have about 200 groups around the world where we dialogue with different religions. And interested in it's actually creating a culture of mutual respect and bring out the knowledge. What I'm wondering is, and I heard it from you, one just that each stays within the circle, within that.
Yes, to go to interfaith dialogues are really only talking to each other because they're not representing their religion. They're just talking to each other. And so a devotee goes to an interfaith dialogue that comes back. It's not that thousands of ISKCON devotees want to know what happened. Tell us about it. And the rabbi goes home. No one wants to eat it. From the priest, Catholic priest, or the Protestant minister. In other words, I mean, it's nice. It's always nice to meet people of other religions, but also there's two problems with interfaith dialogue that kind of diminish my enthusiasm. Not that it's bad. It's nice. It's always nice to make friends. One thing is a meet between two religions. It's really just two people who have almost any influence in their respective religion. Secondly, because there is that mood of, all you need is love. Dun, 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 dun. They avoid the real, for example, oh my God, tonight, Jesus Christ, tonight, there's a link posted. I'm having a discussion. I hope not a debate. Learned who is a Catholic, faithful Catholic, and defends Catholic doctrine, but sort of in a learned way. And so I want to bring up some points. Some points about Christian theology, which I find so. But of course, I'll try to do it in a respectful way. So I think that repercussions or value beyond that means it's going to be recorded and people can see it. So I mean, real serious discussion, issues and the points of contention, but of course, in a fair mutual respect. So, but otherwise, just to get together. Oh, and here's a point. Yeah, Krishna, we eat vegetables. That's amazing. Buddhists also eat vegetables. It's, I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but anyway, but it's nice to make friends. So, Rahman?
So we are beginning to each other about the mind, about not to be trusted. The example of my founder is from this. Um, Getting wild out, not killing by cutting them and never trusting because that has any beliefs. The mind is should be basically treated like a wild animal that is being covered and also here about this services of the core while we define the should and I mean find the programs of that. And we don't I don't really get a sense of how
No, Krishna says, for one who's controlled the mind is a friend. And for one who hasn't controlled the mind is an enemy. So an animal, let's say like a dog, I'm not an animal lover, I'm an animal respecter. But Yeah, a dog who's very trained can really be a good friend. A dog that's not well trained can kill its master. It depends on the training.
What didn't control the life?
Well, you have to strengthen your intelligence. Like you strengthen something by feeding it. And the way you feed the intelligence is take it seriously. If your mind says do this and your intelligence says don't do it anyway, then you're feeding your intelligence, feeding your mind. So the more before we, I mean, some things you don't have to think about it. Like if I'm going to take a walk, I don't have to think about it a lot. But if you have to make decisions in life or how you deal with other people, then you have to be intelligent. Some people are very their intelligence is very weak and their minds are very strong. They have miserable lives.
Share your story with us.
When I was a brahmachari in Berkeley, a new brahmachari, someone said that Bhaktisiddhanta said that before every day you should, beat your mind with a shoe 100 times. So we actually every night the brahmacharis, the little ducklings, every night the brahmachari went to the back of the temple in Berkeley where we had a backyard, and there was some old tennis shoe there. Only one. It was just some old tennis shoe. And so we'd all get in line. And so the first brahmachari would take it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and go to 100, then hand to the next one. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't think anyone really suffered permanent brain damage because we weren't, I mean, we weren't hitting ourselves hard, but it's just like tapping ourselves. So, and I did it too, because when you join the Hare Krishna movement, you realize that everything you thought was real is not real, and that suddenly this is real. It's like, you know, tapping your head with an old tennis shoe is just like, that's much less difficult to understand, let's say, than Garbo Dakshaya Vishnu. So, it's the psychology of the recent convert. Yes.
So the 2 points were, one is the clarify. I'm sorry, what you said, please, with the order of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry, I apologize. I just wanted to go to your point about distinguishing between emotions and attachment. Aren't our attachments driven by?
An attachment is an out of control emotion. It's like your car. If you're driving your car and you lose control or fully, then you're in a very dangerous situation. So yes, attachments are out of control emotions. Yes.
In reference to to clarify a little bit the answer you gave about her question was about looking at some of the secular ways addressing ourselves. And your answer to her was Chana Krishna.
Secular ways?
Secular ways in terms of, let's say, there are many devotees here that are therapists, psychologists, or whatever it may be. So that's considered secular in some. And so her question, as I heard it, was how should one look at applying some of the technique in terms of self-help or address?
Yes.
And your answer to her, well, the end of your answer was ultimately Chandra Krishna.
Yes, but that's the end, not the. If I see, for example, that I become angry too much, or I don't respect other people, or I become depressed. I mean, this is not autobiographical. I'm just giving an example. I would never criticize myself. So, but let's say I notice that I have some emotions which I don't want to have. And so, but That's the intelligence part. It's because I am willing to be critically intelligent about myself. Some people are, because of pride or because of low self-esteem for whatever reason, they won't look at themselves critically. Of course, you can go too far, but so the rational part comes in when you look at yourself objectively. What am I doing? How am I treating other people? How do I think of myself? Low self-esteem is actually a lack of Krishna consciousness. Because if you're Krishna conscious, you see yourself through Krishna's eyes. And because Krishna always loves us, and Krishna always sees that we are very valuable because we're souls, if you see yourself through Krishna's eyes, you will never really be down on yourself. It doesn't mean you approve everything you do. So once I've made the diagnosis, for example, you go to the doctor can run all kinds of sophisticated tests and say, okay, you've got this problem, that problem, whatever. That's the science. But then there's a solution. Because you have these problems, eat this, don't eat that, take that. So the intelligence is the diagnosis. The medicine is Harinama, which Bhaktivinoda Thakur directly says, take this medicine of Harinama. Bhaktivinoda directly says it.
Thank you, because you do have a signature of helping the voters to understand how to address the gap.
Yes,
That.
sure.
My other question is, it's not a question, it's just a commentary from a social activist. And this person was saying that they were using the example that we are all in a caste system, using this example for America, the people in America. Basically, this is a caste system that we're following in America. Most of the people are that don't have a voice, meaning the elite, the people that have money. Most of those people are the untouchables. Is that a totally idiotic statement?
Yes. First of all, um, compared to societies that really have rigid categories, I mean, it's very common that the son of them ends up selling pencils or something, and there are all kinds of self-made people. So at the same time, intelligence, sometimes they're fools with good karma, but let's say people that make money intelligent, they tend to marry intelligent people. And so you tend to get somewhat fixed gene pools. If you think everyone's equal, then it's all exploitation. But in fact, intelligent people, studies show, tend to marry, not always, but tend to marry intelligent people. And they tend to have genetically intelligent kids who also tend to marry other intelligent people. And so therefore you get these communities, these gene communities that tend to marry among themselves. And people who, let's say, for example, are not intellectual and and are suspicious of intellectual people, they also tend to marry, people at their level. So there is mobility, downward and upward. In America, there's a tremendous amount of downward mobility. And also there's some upward mobility. And so it's kind of, these things are sort of in tension. You have the tendency for stasis, the tendency to get sort of somewhat stable gene pools. And at the same time, there's opportunities. There are people who are much more intelligent than their parents. There are people who are much less intelligent than their parents. So if you wanted to be scientific about it, there's lots of variables. So thank you, and it's a pleasure. And thank you all. Actually, I'm having a great time here in the Gita Nagari area, and I really appreciate all the devotees. Hare Krishna. And bye-bye to everybody on media. Oh, Hare Krishna. Hey, hey, fugitives from the law. Hey, Hare Krishna.
Please accept
Hare
our humble
Bo.
obeisances. It's great. What a great lecture. I loved every
Hey, it's great.
minute of it.
It's great to see you guys.
It's wonderful to see you too.
So I'm gonna have to go for breakfast now with the great Atma. Haribo, hope I'll see you soon.
Haribol. Haribol.
Haribo.